All right, I think we have a YouTube connection. So we offer a word of welcome to anybody who's watching by YouTube today. Glad that you've tuned in. Hope others pick it up during the week, that you'll get something out of this to help you on your way in following Christ. We're in the book of Acts. We're in the 23rd chapter. We're drawing towards the end of the book. I think, as I told y'all before, we're going to go into Hebrews next. So read through Hebrews or don't. But anyway, we're going in that direction next, and that'll be we'll kick off. And we're staying on the go throughout the summer. We're not taking a break. Y'all still got to eat every day, so you might as well come here and do it and share in prayer time and fellowship as well. Last week we left off. We're in the middle of the last leg of Paul's life. The last bit of Luke's telling of Paul's life. He went to Jerusalem as he said he was going to do, and he suffered persecution there as he was told he was going to start to suffer. And he's in the middle of suffering that persecution. We're picking up the story. Luke kind of slows down a lot in these last several chapters. We're not covering a lot of material. It's just the stories of Paul's, arrest and trial and imprisonment, and eventually we'll see him taking off for Rome. And that's where Luke's telling of the story comes to a conclusion. Last week, the Roman officials had gotten Paul out of. Everybody was getting ready to kill Paul when the whole mob rule scene came on, and they tried to kill Paul right then and there when the Jews from Asia had seen him in Jerusalem at the time of Pentecost. And so the Roman tribune saves Paul because he was afraid that there was a revolt being fostered in all this. He saves Paul. He finds out that Paul is a Roman citizen, and so he starts to treat Paul a little bit more kindly. And he's trying to figure out what charges are being levied against Paul so that he can determine whether or not the Romans have any part in doing anything about that. So he is sending Paul before the Sanhedrin, that highest court of Jewish officials and leaders. It's composed of Pharisees and Sadducees, the high priest. And so Paul is being brought before the Sanhedrin. The Roman tribune's hope was that they would come up with a charge that they could bring to the Romans so that they could figure out what to do about Paul. Because Paul is a Roman citizen, they can't just, have him killed. And unless he's broken some Roman law, he can't really be tried by Rome on such a consideration. So we pick up there. The words this week are in red, so you can see them better than last week. So let's pick up there with the opening of chapter 23. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a leader of your people.'" When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees' group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, The tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also in Rome." Now this is an interesting scene, and you have to make a choice. It's kind of like, y'all ever seen the movie Clue? And you get to pick which ending you want for it and all. Well, you get to pick which way you want to understand this scene that's stretched out before us. Scholars, are divided as to whether, Paul is genuinely trying to appeal to the Sanhedrin on good terms, or whether he's, being savvy. We might even say, is he being like Christ? Whenever Jesus dealt with the religious leaders, he always, he had multiple things going on. He would deal with them, but he would also put them in conundrums because he knew they were trying to put him in a conundrum. And so he would always turn the trap around on them. And so he was always savvy in the way he dealt with the religious leader. So is Paul being more conniving is maybe too hard a word, but has he got an agenda going on here, and he's really kind of trying to show up the council, or is he just genuinely trying to make his case before them and win their approval of him, at least on the basis of his being a fellow Jew and a fellow Pharisee? And you can, when you read the story, when you think through the story, you can kind of see the evidence going in both directions. Those who see this as a kind of calculated way of kind of showing up the Sanhedrin point to the fact that Paul starts off with a too casual of a greeting. He calls them brethren. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said brothers. This is the high council, the Sanhedrin. And, you just don't go in there and act like you're on the same level as they are. Now, of course, Paul was on the same level as they were in the sense that he was a Pharisee, but he was not in the Sanhedrin. So he says brothers instead of offering some kind of, more deferential kind of greeting. So is he kind of bringing them down to his level by saying that? Second thing that might lead us to think that he's got an ulterior motive going on here is that he makes a provocative claim about having lived a righteous life to this point. I'm going to say more about this in a second. I have lived my life with a clear conscience. We'll say more about that in just a minute. And then, as soon as he says that, then the high priest has him struck. And when the high priest has him struck, how does Paul come back? He's not turning the other cheek. What does Paul say? God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck? The high priest should not have had him struck like that. That was an affront to him. But of course, Paul shouldn't have said that to the high priest. And that raises the question: does Paul know that this is the high priest or not? The rest of the council says to him, "Don't you know this is the high priest? How dare you speak to him like that?" And Paul says, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people." Is that genuine? Is he really saying that he didn't know that this was the high priest? And if it is, how did he not know it was the high priest? He's in the Sanhedrin. He knows how things go. How could he have not known this was the high priest? And yet he basically insults the high priest. And we're going to say in just a second, he uses one of Jesus's lines, calling him a whitewashed wall. We'll say something more about that in just a second. And then the last thing that kind of gives, if you're thinking that he's actually trying to undermine the counselor, that he's taking them to task somehow, is the fact that when he looks around and he sees, he notices that there are Sadducees and Pharisees in the group. And he should have assumed that, So he knows they're in there, and so he brings up the subject of the resurrection. Why does he do that? There's a question. He knows the Sadducees and the Pharisees always argue about the resurrection. And so, he makes it sound like, here I am, a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee, and yet I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Why should I be on trial for the hope of the resurrection? You all agree to it. You know that there's a resurrection. And so it seems like he's trying to confuse the issue. Or is he just trying to find common ground with the Pharisees? See what I'm getting at there? You can make some decisions about what you think Paul is doing here, whether he's just genuinely coming to them and engaging them and trying to find common ground to make his case, or if he's kind of trying to confuse them. And Jesus was always confounding the religious leaders by turning the problem back on them and leaving them speechless in the end. Is that what Paul is trying to do here? What do y'all think? He's playing angles. That's a good phrase. Does it seem like he's playing angles? Anybody else? Okay, sarcastic. What'd you say, John? So you think he was trying to come? Yeah, okay. You can make cases either way. Yeah. If he was using that, those words, again, how do you take these words that he says here? I did not realize, brothers, that he was a high priest. Is that him saying legitimately, I didn't realize he was the high priest? I wouldn't have said that if he had been. Or is he saying, I didn't see him as being the high priest? He could have said, you're not acting like a high priest, so why should I consider you the high priest? Because I wouldn't treat the high priest that way. Yeah. Right. And again, you can read it both ways. It's hard. You can find evidence in both directions. Interesting stuff, interesting things to think about, and it'll affect the way that you read the whole of the passage. There are a couple things to say about some of these things before we move on. First of all, about Ananias, the high priest. He really is not much of a high priest. The historical background shows us that he was a pretty conniving sort of fellow himself. He used power. He used deceit. He was a money grubber. He was in it for, the position. And he was deferential to Rome. He was Rome's puppet as the high priest. And so I think I wrote in there in the notes, when the Roman siege came upon Jerusalem because of the revolt against the Romans, some of the patriot Jews, found him. He was in hiding, and they took him out and they killed him because he was not a friend to the Jews. They killed the high priest because he had been friendly to the Romans and not to the Jews. And of course, this is the Jewish revolt was a purging of the Romans. Anybody with Roman influence, anybody with Roman connections, they were trying to kill off anyway. But that's how they saw him. He was not highly respected. And so when he calls him a whitewashed wall, whether he's doing it intentionally or not, whether it's just a happy coincidence or an intended barb, he's not far off. He's exactly who Jesus, was talking about when he, spoke those words against the religious leaders in his day. You remember that passage. It's on the third page there. I've got it highlighted. Matthew 23, 27 through 28. The whole of chapter 23, Matthew's gospel, is a diatribe against the Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders. And near the end of it, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Paul calls Ananias a whitewashed wall, the same kind of thing, a wall being painted over to make it look good when instead it's really crumbling and getting ready to fall. Its substance is lacking. It's actually depraved. It's falling apart. It's the same kind of image. And Paul seems to borrow that from Jesus, I think, in castigating Ananias. Another thing to think about is that claim that Paul makes there at the very start. Brothers, up to this day, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. That sounds like Paul so much, and it reminds us of a couple of things in Paul's letters. First, for me, it reminded me of that part in Philippians chapter 3. Paul he's making the point, he's headed towards making the point that he's given up everything for the sake of Christ, and that he was at the pinnacle in Jewish life before he became a Christian. And yet he gave it all up and gave it up gladly so that he could know Christ, even though he was suffering. Well, as he builds up his case for himself being the Hebrew of the Hebrews, you know these words from Philippians chapter 3. If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. He kept the law. He was zealous for the law. And so he kept those rules. He ticked them off. These words he speaks before the Sanhedrin, for me, they kind of, they're kind of like his saying, I've done everything the way I'm supposed to do it. And in the Philippians instance, he's using that as a foil against his claim, that he's given it all up so that he could know Christ, and how much better it is that he knows Christ than that he was that Pharisee, the Pharisees. It also made me think about the many times that Paul writes to the believers and tells them to imitate him. And, those words don't go over so well with us. We think, they sound kind of like he's bragging, but he's really not. He's intentionally trying to live the way of Christ, and he's not saying, I'm perfect. He's saying, imitate me. Watch how I'm trying to follow Christ. You follow Christ that way too. I'm conscientious. I'm intentional. I want to follow Christ. I want to do everything he tells me to do. Paul, at the same time he says those words, says in other places, I'm the worst of the sinners. I'm the last person who should be an apostle, and yet it was God's grace that made me an apostle. And so it's not bragging and saying, look at me, I'm great. It's saying, I am zealous to know God's way and to do God's work and to follow it completely. I did it as a Pharisee, and I'm doing it as a follower of Jesus Christ. I think that's the spirit of what he's saying before the Sanhedrin. I have no qualms about anything that I have done up to this day. I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. Wherever God has led me, I have followed. And so, as I thought God led me to be the Pharisee of the Pharisees, I followed. And then when God called me to follow Jesus Christ, I followed Christ. So I have no qualms. I have done, as far as I know what God's will is, I have done it. Now, why does that make Ananias so crazy? Well, if Paul has followed God's will and way and ended up with Jesus Christ, why haven't they? It's his personal rebuke to them for continuing to be a persecutor of the church when Paul is now the zealous follower of Jesus Christ. And so it seems to be that that's what sets off Ananias. It's almost like he's judging them. I have no qualms. You probably should. You're still living by the law of Moses, but I have no qualms. I know I'm doing what's right. I'm following Jesus Christ. I'm no longer following in the way of the law of Moses. I'm following the way of Jesus Christ. So it was a rebuke to them. At least that's how Ananias heard it, I think. And that's why he responds so viciously to him. Strike him in the mouth. Thoughts or comments about any of that? The end result of it all is what? Whether he's intentionally trying to tweak them, or whether he's honestly and sincerely trying to win them over, on the same basis, showing that he's on common ground, the end result is the same. He ends up with them wanting to kill him again. They're at his throat. The tribune is afraid that they're going to tear him to pieces, the text tells us. They're livid with Paul once again. And so he has to intervene once again to save Paul from the angry mob spirit that is right there in front of him. They're in the Sanhedrin. So either way, whichever way you think Paul is going, whatever you think Paul is trying to do in that encounter, it ends up with the same result. He's back at in the hands of an angry mob. Verse 11, that night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." God is saving him. These are words of assurance. God has saved him, God has preserved him, and God has a plan and a purpose for him. And so his end isn't right here. It isn't right now. God's going to take him to Rome. And so whatever happens to him, even though it's costly, even though it brings pain, even though it brings trouble, even though it brings imprisonment, it's not the final chapter in the story. God has other plans for him, and God will preserve him. And the rest of the chapter shows us exactly how God preserves his life. Any thoughts or questions about that first part before we go to the second part? Yeah, it's another way of saying, you're suffering now and you're going to get to suffer there too. Yeah. As I've said before, anytime God assures you that he's with you and, be of courage, that means it's going to be a hard road. And that's part of this, yes, sobering message. It is. All right. Oh, go ahead. In that capacity, I'm not sure. Yeah, in a worship ceremony kind of thing, yes, definitely. In that capacity, yeah, and that's what's hard. More than likely, I would think he was dressed somehow to demarcate himself from the rest, and he would be taking the leadership role in the meeting. And Paul, Paul hadn't been in Jerusalem the whole time, but Paul knows Jerusalem. And so it does seem hard. It's hard to make sense of his saying, "I didn't know he was the high priest." It is hard to make sense of that. It sounds like he's genuinely offering an apology, but it's hard to make sense that he wouldn't know that was the high priest who had just addressed him. So again, it's a mysterious kind of passage, and you can go in both directions. It gives you lots of evidence to go one way or the other, and it's just hard to make a final call. So, yes. Yeah. You can see it being a cynical kind of reply. If I had known I was talking to the high priest, I wouldn't have said that. Oh, he is the high priest? He knows he is, but he's not acting like one. So, all right, verse 12. In the morning, the next day, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case, and we are ready to do away with him before he arrives." Y'all understand the nature of the plot. Some of the Jews Those surrounding the people in the Sanhedrin come up with a conspiracy, a plan. We're not going to eat or drink anything until we've killed Paul. And here's how we're going to do it. Y'all tell the tribune that you need to see him again to continue your investigation. And before he even gets to the place, we're going to ambush him and we're going to kill him. That'll take care of things. So that's the plan. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush. We never hear anything about Paul's sister or the nephew or any family relations, and yet here it comes up. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him." So he took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, "What is it that you have to report to me?" He answered, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of this." Again, stop for just a second. Paul's sister, don't know anything about her, don't know anything else about her, don't know anything about his nephew, but here is somebody who finds out about the plot. This reminds me of the story of Esther, Mordecai. You know how Mordecai heard about the plot against the king and how that put him in good favor, and how that later came back to help bring about a good resolution of things with the Jews. Well, it's a similar kind of thing. Here's somebody completely out of the realm of our knowledge of things, and yet he finds out about the plot. God works behind the scenes and works to preserve his saints and to preserve his purposes. Note, this isn't going to save Paul's life and keep him from trouble. It's just going to give him the opportunity to continue to minister for Christ. Paul will ultimately die for the faith. This is just giving him a few, years extra or whatever before he dies. He's going to die for Christ, but this is God's plan. It's being carried out, and God preserves it. Behind the scenes maneuver. Interesting to me also, the tribune took him by the hand, verse 19. The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked. It seems like the tribune, that's an interesting phrase. It's kind of an intimate phrase. He took him by the hand. Why does Luke report that, number one? And it seems to be a tender touch to the story, as if maybe this was a young man. Maybe he was a very fearful, of relaying this information to the tribune. Maybe he was fearing for his own life. Maybe it was the tribune had come to admire Paul in all this. We don't know what Paul has been saying to him, in between scenes. We don't know how he's been witnessing to him, but he's witnessed Paul's example. And so maybe the tribune is coming to think Paul is onto something. But it's a tender touch in the story. It makes me think that there's some sympathy on the part of the tribune with Paul. Certainly he organizes everything, and he's going to lay out the plans here in the verses that remain. Verse 23, "Then the tribune summoned two of the centurions and said, 'Get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen.'" Now that ain't no small cohort, right? He fears a big kind of battle. If he's been told there are 40 people ready to kill him, then he's going on the assumption there may be a whole lot more behind that 40. And so he really loads up on the protection he's going to provide for Paul. Verse 24, "Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect: "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews," he's speaking of Paul, "and was about to be killed by them. But when I had learned that he was a Roman, I came with the guard and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they accused him, I had him brought to their council. I found that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering these accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So he's basically saying, I'm sending Paul to you. Here's what's happened. You should hear their side of the story, but you need to keep Paul safe, because there are enemies that are seeking to take his life. And remember, he is a Roman. We can't let him be killed unjustly. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatris. That's a city just below Caesarea. If you have your map, it's right before you get to Caesarea. The next day, they let the horsemen go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So they had escorted the parade to that point. When they came to Caesarea, that is, the horsemen with Paul, and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belonged to, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. He makes sure that Paul is a Roman, and so when the accusers arrive, he will have a hearing, and everybody will get to say what they want to say. Then he ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. So God acts to preserve Paul's life so that Paul can continue to do his work. Important point there, subtle point. We are all servants of Christ in our life. Our health and well-being, important to God, of course, but ultimately our service to God trumps everything else. We as Christians have life eternally with the Father, and that's the main thing. This life is not the main thing. The life in the age to come is the main thing, and so our lives are guaranteed to be with God whenever. I mean, we're all going to die. When we die and how we die are the open-ended questions, but we have life with God in the world that is to come, the world that will bring all this to an end. And so ultimately what matters is not, our, escaping injury and death and disease in this life. What matters is, have we served Christ faithfully as he has appointed our lives to serve him? That's what counts. And God will preserve us and care for us and watch over us so that we can accomplish his work in the world. Again, we see how the Jews hated Paul, hated the church. Imagine, coming together and getting together and making an oath that, we won't eat or drink until we get this guy killed. It's one thing to have a religious, devotion kind of thing that you're doing, but it's another to take another person's life and that be what you bind yourself together with others to do. Of course, to be fair to the Jews, they considered Paul a blasphemer, and so they thought they were doing God's work. Any closing thoughts, comments, questions? All right. Thanks for being here. Hope you'll be back next week. Stay warm on the first day of summer.